Chapter 4. 3 Knocks. As William wandered through the crowd, still feeling giddy from his romantic dinner, he noticed Eric's father passed out on the ground in the corner of the drinker's grotto. This suddenly reminded him that he'd left his best friend stranded alone with Father Marcus. Just as William spun around to look for Eric, he found himself staring directly at him. Eric was standing behind him with his arms crossed and an eyebrow raised. "Eric!" exclaimed William in surprise, relieved to see him still in one piece. "Sorry I never came back," he finished guiltily. Eric shook his head. "We should talk," he said seriously. "Aye," agreed William with a sigh. As much as it pained him, chatting with Eric about what had happened might help. If anybody could make sense of the situation, it would be Eric. Ever since they were kids, he had always seemed to know the right thing to do. Will nodded towards an empty table expectantly. Eric agreed before suddenly catching himself. "Hold on, I'll be there in a moment," said Eric, turning around and walking over to where the gents were drinking and being merry. Once Will had taken his seat, he realized why Eric had done this as he came back carrying 2 tankards of ale. William let out a laugh. "Thank you, brother, but it isn't for me. I still can't stand the taste of the stuff," said Will, shaking his head. "You won't be drinking it for the taste," replied Eric, pushing the tankard of ale towards Will. He begrudgingly accepted it after he realized what Eric meant. Eric raised his tankard, and Will reciprocated, clinking them together before they both began to drink. There were a few moments of silence as the 2 boys drank and quietly processed the situation. "So, how was Anne-Marie?" asked Eric. Will took a deep breath and released a sigh. "You know her. She's strong. I think all things considered, she's doing all right," said Will. Eric nodded understandingly and took another sip of his ale. "Do ye still love her?" asked Eric, catching William off guard. He blushed bright red as he tried to find the right words to respond. Do I what?" asked Will, knowing full well what Eric had asked. He stammered nervously for a moment before realizing that there was no real reason to be so coy with Eric. He let out a sigh. "Aye, I do," he replied quietly. Again Eric nodded understandingly. There was a quiet moment while Eric seemed to be sizing Will up. "What are you looking at me like that for?" asked William defensively. Eric took a deep breath. "Will, I'm just going to talk about this bluntly with you, okay?" said Eric, making Will feel even more worried about the difficult conversation they were about to have. William nodded and furrowed his brow incredulously, as though it should be obvious that he's tough enough to handle such a difficult conversation. "William, after you'd left they kept on talking. He really did mean it, you know. He means to make Anne-Marie his wife," said Eric somberly. William's heart sank. Anne-Marie had been right. Marcus's proposal was being taken seriously after all. But it were barely even a proposal. All he said was, "wife." "If I looked at a horse and said, 'food,' would they serve it up to me?" rationalized Will. Eric smirked at his quip, but shook his head. "The mayor said he'll be discussing it with her parents in the morning." "I thought you ought to know," said Eric seriously. "What is there to discuss? She don't want it," growled Will angrily. The entire situation was completely devoid of justice. "It's complicated, Will," began Eric. "It ain't," interjected William. Eric closed his eyes and nodded understandingly. "It ain't complicated. If she don't want it, then it shouldn't happen," said William. Eric continued to nod in agreement. "I agree with you, William. So listen to me. We have to make a very important decision," began Eric. William inhaled nervously as he anticipated where Eric was going with this. "Do we want to get involved in this?" he asked firmly. William stared back at him blankly. "What do you mean?" asked William. "Do you think that you and I should try to help Anne-Marie?" reiterated Eric. William took a long swig from his tankard as he considered Eric's question sincerely. Was it really their place? This was between Anne-Marie and her parents. It wasn't any of his business. For him and Eric to try to get involved would not only complicate the situation for everybody, but it would also tarnish the names of each of their own families too. Stepping in and fighting against somebody else's marriage was as taboo as it got. You would be seen as meddling in affairs that weren't your own and disrespecting the sanctity of marriage itself. What made this situation especially dire was that they wouldn't be fighting against just anybody's marriage, but against the marriage of Father Marcus, a cleric of Bethmael, the hero of their village. What hope did the two of them have of making any kind of difference here? The more Will thought about it, the more helpless the whole thing seemed. He closed his eyes, finally accepting the situation for what it was. I want to help her, he said firmly. Eric assessed his expression. After a moment, he released a small smile. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. William stared back at his friend. He wondered whether Eric would have been disappointed in him if he'd said no. Either way, he appreciated the candid way he'd approached the conversation. Eric was just as reliable as he'd always been. So, what can we do? Asked William, the hopelessness of the situation now lingering incredibly clearly before both of them. Eric took a final swig from his tankard, finishing it off before sitting back in his chair and assuming the same familiar expression that he'd worn when he'd first been looking at Father Marcus and the knights. Seeing this look on Eric's face restored some hope in Will's heart. This expression meant that Eric was thinking about a situation deeply, and if anybody could find a solution, it would be him. Okay, so, began Eric. From what I know, the clerics do not take wives, he said flatly. Will stared back at him blankly. Wait, what? Asked Will, dumbfounded. If they aren't allowed to take a wife, then surely he can't marry Anne-Marie, reasoned William excitedly. No, that's not what I said, replied Eric, holding a finger up to quell William's premature excitement. I said that they don't take wives. I never said that it was forbidden, reiterated Eric. I don't get it, replied William, confused. I don't fully understand the situation either. All I know is that in a book that I was reading which mentioned the clerics, it explained that part of their oath is that of celibacy, explained Eric. As William fathomed what Eric was saying, he felt sick to his stomach. He hadn't dared even let himself think about how sex factors into all of this yet. Although at first it made William feel sick, he suddenly felt a sparkle of hope form in his chest again. Wait, so can they take a wife or not? Asked William. Eric pondered the question for a moment. I suppose, technically, they could perhaps take a wife, but simply not consummate the marriage. He finished with a shrug. William felt a little relief flood over him. He picked up his tankard and swallowed down what was left to steady himself. Well, that's a good start, right? Asked William, unsure of where they could take this train of thought, but feeling that they'd somehow already begun lifting a corner on the whole affair. Eric nodded reticently. Listen, the man is a mess. I don't know how much longer he even has in this world. You've seen him. He's covered in wounds. He can barely hold himself up. He talks to himself all day long. There's always the option of... Eric trailed off somberly. William stared back at him blankly. We could always just, wait it out, finished Eric. William felt a chill run down his spine at the mere thought of it. No, you said we'd figure out a way to get Anne-Marie out of it. We don't even know how long it would take. It could be years that she'd need to be married to that creep, yelled William passionately. I know, but if all else fails, there will still be hope, explained Eric. William took a breath to steady his nerves as Eric's words sank in. Keep going. What's another solution then? Asked William, wanting to change the subject. Before Eric could respond, there was suddenly a commotion from the drinkers' grotto. The boys looked over and immediately realized what the cause was when they saw Eric's father stumbling hopelessly into a keg stand, toppling it over and falling to the ground, spraying ale everywhere. "Hey, hey, what do you think you're doing?" cried out the men who had been drinking beside him. "Oh, shut up," slurred Eric's father, rolling on the floor in the puddle of ale and feebly attempting to get to his feet. Once vaguely upright, he spat in their general direction before collapsing face first back down into the ground with a groan. Eric let out a frustrated sigh. He hurried over to his father as quickly as he could. "Get off me," slurred his father when Eric tried to help him up. "It's me, father. Let's get you somewhere more comfortable, eh?" asked Eric soothingly. "Get off of me, you fat pig," shouted his father drunkenly, swinging his fist at Eric's face and connecting hard. Eric winced in pain, but didn't back off. "Up you get, father," said Eric, lifting his father up to his knees. "Piggy, piggy, piggy, here, piggy! Suey!" shouted his father drunkenly, cackling and slapping his son's belly. The scene was very difficult for William to watch. If it were anybody else speaking to his friend like that, he'd jump to his defense, but in this case all he could find in himself to do was sit and helplessly watch as Eric was publicly humiliated. Eric managed to get his father to his feet and began walking him away from the drinking grotto, his father protesting all the way. As he approached Will, he stopped for a moment. "William, I'll keep thinking about our problem. Let's talk again in the morning," said Eric, struggling to keep his father upright. William nodded soberly. "What are you looking at? You want to go?" yelled Eric's father, swinging an arm loosely at Will. "Come on, father, let's go," said Eric, leading his father away and off into the night. As he watched their silhouettes disappear, Will let out a deep sigh. There was nothing more that he'd be able to do tonight. He looked around the party. Many of the townsfolk were still out celebrating, but he couldn't see Anne-Marie anywhere. With Anne-Marie and Eric both gone, he questioned whether there was any reason left for him to stay. He certainly didn't have the spirits to go and try to be merry with the rest of the townsfolk. The last thing he felt like doing right now was celebrating. As he began to walk around aimlessly, he suddenly caught sight of his mother, laughing heartily with a group of other village women. As soon as he saw her, a warm feeling spread in his belly. All he wanted to do was hug her and ask for her guidance, but when he saw how happy she looked, he realized that the last thing he should do is dump his worries on her. "Ma! Ma!" a voice suddenly called out. Sasha and her friend burst out from the crowd and ran up to his mother. "Yes, sweetie?" asked his mother. "Can I stay over at Isabel's house tonight?" asked Sasha passionately, grabbing onto Isabel's hand and squeezing it tight. Her mother feigned struggling to make up her mind. She said, tapping her chin as though mulling it over deeply. "Oh, do please say yes, mother," pleaded Sasha desperately. "Okay then," confirmed their mother finally. Sasha and Isabel started dancing around excitedly together. William smiled at the wholesome scene before he began making his quiet retreat back home. He hadn't had a chance to ease up his nerves until now, and being among the warmth of his family finally gave him the opportunity to relax a little. It had led him to realize how drained the night's happenings had left him. He turned around, disappearing into the night, his mind aflame with burdensome thoughts. Was he really going to be able to do anything for Anne-Marie, or was he going to have to watch as she was married to that dark and terrifying man? As he opened his front door, a strange feeling washed over him. Being the only one home was very unusual for Will. The entire house had a cold and foreign feeling to it without his family inside. He splashed his face with water from the barrel outside on his way in, heading straight for his room and changing out of his fancy tunic. He collapsed face first down on his bed and let out a deep sigh. His small room was ordinarily shared with Sasha, but without her here he'd be sleeping in the room alone. It was another cold and unusual feeling for him to not have her candlelight flickering in the corner while she read her books well past his bedtime. Tap, tap, tap. Will opened his eyes and flipped over onto his back. Had he imagined that sound? He waited completely still and silent for a moment. Tap, tap, tap. He heard it again. Suddenly he was hit by a cannonball of nostalgia and excitement as memories came flooding back into his mind. When they were children, he and Anne-Marie would both climb inside their wardrobes and talk to each other through the wall every night. This knocking on her wardrobe's back wall was how she used to get his attention. He shot out of bed and almost fell over in his hurry to get into his wardrobe. Climbing inside the tiny wardrobe was far more difficult as a teenager, but somehow he managed to squeeze himself inside and crouch down with his ear against the wall. After a moment of waiting, he finally remembered that it was his turn to knock. Tap, tap, tap. He knocked back on the wall. "William?" asked Anne-Marie's voice. Immediately his heart started racing. I'm here," answered Will enthusiastically. "I saw you walking past my window, and I just wanted to say—" she began, trailing off for a moment. "Huh?" asked William, struggling to hear her through the wall. "I just wanted to say, thank ye for the dinner," said Anne-Marie. William felt his stomach filling with warmth. His love for this girl was somehow still growing. How could she be thinking about him at a time like this? "It were nothing. Thank you for eating with me," he replied awkwardly, blushing in the darkness. There was another moment of silence from her side. "Will, do you know why I came and joined you?" she asked. He thought back to that moment. It had taken all of the courage they'd had to approach those knights and take those seats. It must have been just as daunting for her, if not more, considering that she had been alone. "No?" asked William, only now honestly putting himself in her shoes. "I was jealous," she said. "What? Jealous of who?" asked Will, completely dumbfounded. "I saw you talking with that lady knight, and I don't know. I guess I've never really seen you talking with any other girls before," she said quietly before giggling. "Hey, I talk to plenty of girls," shouted William defensively, before chuckling himself when he realized that she was right. "Hold on a minute. You were jealous of Dame Azalea?" blurted Will in shock when he honestly processed what Anne-Marie was saying. "Of course I was," said Anne-Marie, not elaborating any further. There was an awkward moment of silence as neither of the two knew what to say next. "Well, I'm sorry too," said William honestly. "What? What do you have to be sorry about?" asked Anne-Marie. "When you were in Wilton's cottage, I was listening to your conversation," admitted Will. Now was as good a time as any to admit to his eavesdropping. There was a moment of silence from her side. "So, was your uncle right?" she asked quietly. William racked his brain to remember that conversation, which now felt like it had happened so long ago. Then it finally clicked in his mind. His uncle had told her that Will fancied her. He took a deep breath. Here it was. It was now or never. "Aye, he was," said Will, his head spinning with anxiety. There was a long moment of silence from Anne-Marie, which only accentuated Will's panic. Had he said the wrong thing? Had he made her uncomfortable again? "I thought you were going to kiss me," said Anne-Marie suddenly, only making Will's heart beat even faster. "Huh?" exclaimed Will in surprise. "Up at the cottage. I thought you were going to kiss me," admitted Anne-Marie coyly. William could feel so much nervous energy building up in his chest that he could barely contain himself. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," said William, cursing himself for his own stupidity. Her next words hit him like an arrow through his heart. "I wanted you to kiss me, William," she clarified. The overwhelming joy he felt coursing through his body was making him feel giddy. Before he could respond, they both heard the front door of her house slam shut. "My father's home. I have to go," said Anne-Marie suddenly. "Anne-Marie, William caught himself. He didn't want to put his foot in his mouth and say something overly sappy. He'd done enough by confirming that he fancied her. "Good night," he ended simply, placing his palm up against the back of his wardrobe, longing to feel her touch. "Good night, William," she whispered back. And with that, all of the anxiety and fear that had been filling William's head was gone. His house no longer felt cold and empty. He no longer felt alone. He made his way over to his bed, sinking back into his pillow and closing his eyes. Maybe tonight wasn't so bad after all. Chapter 5. The Shadow of Matrimony. William was woken by a loud commotion that made him jump upright in his bed. He soon realized that the sound was coming through the wall from Anne-Marie's house. She was arguing loudly with her father about something. At first, William tried wrapping his pillow around his ears so as not to listen in and to get some more sleep, but then all of the events of the previous night came rushing back. He let out a groan and lay flat on his back. Should he listen in to their argument or not? It could be about Father Marcus. Either way, it wasn't any of his business. But after the conversation he'd had with Eric last night, he wouldn't be doing his due diligence if he didn't at least try to listen in, right? He quietly crept up to the wall and placed his ear against it. He was barely able to make out any of the words that they were saying. They were clearly not in Anne-Marie's room, but he could hear that things were getting rather heated. Both Anne-Marie and her father could be heard yelling loudly at one another. "I hate you!" he heard Anne-Marie scream before stomping footsteps could be heard growing closer. Her bedroom door slammed shut, making Will jump back from the wall and rub his ear. Anxiety began tying a knot in his stomach as he guessed what this conversation was likely about. Eric had said that the mayor would be going to their house to talk about the proposal in the morning. He could only guess that he'd overslept and missed the whole affair. As he began to hear Anne-Marie's mournful sobbing, his heart ached for her. He turned around and sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. He wanted dearly to hug her and tell her that it was going to be okay. But right now, all he could do was sit here, eavesdropping on her and being there for her in spirit at least. He distantly heard an intense conversation between Anne-Marie's mother and father before hearing their front door slam shut too. Their whole family seemed to be in disarray. He shook his head. He felt utterly useless. He told Eric that they'd meet up and discuss things more today, but what was he honestly bringing to the table? He had no ideas. He was pulled from his self-defamatory thoughts when Anne-Marie's mother knocked lightly on her door and entered. He took a deep breath. If he wanted to hear this conversation clearly, he was going to have to really strain himself. He pressed his right ear up against the wall again and covered his left, listening intently. "Go away," yelled Anne-Marie, still crying. "Sweetheart, let me talk to you," implored her mother. "There's naught to talk about. I won't do it," asserted Anne-Marie. There were a few moments of silence as William heard the faint sounds of movement. "You know, when I first met your father, I didn't want to marry him either," said her mother. Anne-Marie didn't respond, continuing to quietly sob. William's heart sank. So Eric had been right. The mayor really had already visited and discussed the affair. "He's big and smelly and hairy. Do you really think I wanted him?" asked her mother jokingly. Anne-Marie let out a slight giggle. "I used to tell me Ma, if you make me marry that animal, I'll never talk to you again," recalled her mother. Anne-Marie sniffled some more. "Really?" she asked, fascinated by her mother's story. "Aye, it's the truth. But you see, all my family had were a few goats. His family had a whole herd of cows, 12 of them," exclaimed her mother. Anne-Marie silently listened on. "My father offered his field as a dowry to marry me. He knew that marrying me into a good family like your father's would keep me safe and secure for the rest of me life, explained her mother. Anne-Marie quietly processed her words for a moment. Yeah, well, he might be fat and hairy, but at least he isn't a creep like Father Marcus, said Anne-Marie, reigniting her tears as she recalled how scary the man was. There were a few moments of quiet as William could hear her mother gently soothing her. Ye know, when I was your age, there was one man in the village that every girl dreamed of marrying, began her mother. Who was it? Asked Anne-Marie. It were Marcus, replied her mother seriously. You're joking me, exclaimed Anne-Marie. I'm totally serious. Every single girl was after that man. No matter how much we swooned, though, he never proposed to any of us, explained her mother. You know, one reason I was so angry that my parents arranged my marriage with your father is because I was wanting to save myself for Marcus, explained her mother. What? Squeaked Anne-Marie at her mother incredulously. It's true. I thought, one day he'll come back from that gateway, and by then he'll be wanting a wife. I thought it would be romantic if I waited. I thought I was going to sweep him off his feet, said her mother with a chuckle. Anne-Marie giggled lovingly at her mother's naivety. He was so handsome, you know. Long black hair and big muscles from chopping wood all day. Even when I was a young girl, I remember seeing him when he was your age. He was a real sweetheart, too. He weren't like any man I'd ever seen. He loved animals, so I would always see him talking to my goats and patting them on the head on his way home, recalled her mother. Are ye sure you're talking about Father Marcus? Asked Anne-Marie in disbelief. Aye, he'd always be helping out around the village too, recalled her mother fondly. Don't go falling in love again, Ma, warned Anne-Marie jokingly. Her mother giggled. Aye, I just might. He was such a good man. Not just handsome, he helped others when they were in need. He stood up for the other kids when they were bullied. He even saved animals when they were sick. They don't make 'em like that anymore. They never really did. I suppose that's why they let him become one of them clerics, thought her mother aloud. What do you mean? Asked Anne-Marie. Well, they don't let just anybody become a cleric of Bethmael. Why do you think we're all so proud of him? Why do you think he has 3 knights travelling with him? Asked her mother. To keep him safe, guessed Anne-Marie. No, darling, it's not just that. It's to show how much the king respects him. They are showing the world, look at this man, he is a cleric of Bethmael. He is the best of all of us, proclaimed her mother passionately, again making Anne-Marie giggle. Ma! He really scares me, said Anne-Marie earnestly. I know, sweetheart. He scares us all, but there was something my grandma told me about the Great War. She said when her father returned to Lacdorian after fighting, he was scary too. He weren't the same man anymore. Dealing with those monsters, it changes people, said her mother seriously. There were a few moments of silence. Listen, deep down, he's still that kind-hearted special boy that we all remember. I know he is. You can't take all of that away from a man. It's what made him who he is, explained her mother ardently. But I don't love him, Ma. He terrifies me, reiterated Anne-Marie. I know he does, sweetheart, but try to put yourself in your father's shoes. How do you think it'll look if he denies a proposal from a cleric of Bethmael to his daughter, a Lacdorian milkmaid? Asked her mother. I don't care how it looks, replied Anne-Marie. Have ye forgotten what I told you already? This is a man who travels with a group of 3 of the kingdom's glorious knights. Your father wouldn't only be denying Father Marcus, he'd be spitting in the face of the king. He'd be saying that a man who has the king's approval don't have his own. Do you know how that would look? She asked seriously. Anne-Marie stayed silent as she pondered the reality of the situation. Would they hurt him? Asked Anne-Marie after a short moment. Her mother sighed. I don't know, sweetheart. But you should know, your father would let himself be executed if it meant making you happy. It wouldn't matter, though. Even if he was dead, the proposal wouldn't go away. explained her mother solemnly. William slumped his shoulders in defeat as the chilling reality set in for him too. No wonder Eric made such a big deal about them accepting the risk of fighting against this marriage. Had Eric already thought about all of this? William was once again in awe of his intelligence. "Sweetie, how about this? Just meet with the man. Try talking with him and see if that sweet boy I remember is still in there," asked her mother quietly. "No, Mother, he is so scary," whimpered Anne-Marie, her voice quivering. William shivered as he too remembered how it felt sitting close to the man. "I know he is, but don't forget what he's been dealing with at that gateway over the years. Give him some time. I promise, sweetheart, he's a good man deep down. I think you might be able to bring that out of him," explained her mother. There was a short silence. "Don't do it for yourself. Do it for your father," said her mother. William cringed, deciding to stop listening at this point. He was beginning to feel sick from what he was hearing. The more the situation crystallized, the more hopeless it became. As he leant forward and hugged his knees, his emotions began threatening to get the best of him. As soon as he noticed tears beginning to form in his eyes, he quickly stood up and started beating his chest to quell them. He wasn't going to just sit here and cry. His father hadn't raised him that way. When the going got tough, his father had always told him that a real man should buckle down and work harder. So that's exactly what he was going to do. As he made his way out to the stables, he made a decision with complete conviction. He would save Anne-Marie no matter what it took. He wasn't going to let this happen without a fight. Eric lay with his eyes closed, straining his brain. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a hint, a clue, a corner of this carpet for him to pull at. As soon as he had but a single thread that he could pull, maybe he could unravel this whole situation. He was yanked from his thoughts when his father rolled over in his sleep, kicking the side of Eric's head roughly. He let out a sigh. He needed to get out of this cramped little wagon. The second he hopped out of the back of the wagon, he realized just how close to the night's caravan they were situated. The majority of those who had travelled up from the surrounding areas had spent the night camped out in this same small part of town. Lacdorian was a small place, but Eric had for some reason imagined some kind of lavish living situation set up for the knights and Father Marcus. Instead, there they were, practically mixed in with the commoners, aside from their considerably larger and fancier caravan. Last night there had been somebody making a terrible racket. There was screaming, moaning and crying. Eric had assumed it was some drunken domestic argument and fallen back asleep. However, now that he realized where the knight's caravan was, he began to question whether that's where he'd heard the commotion from. Azalea and August were sitting out on tree stumps eating bowls of porridge. Ivar was pacing back and forth with his arms crossed, muttering to himself. He did not look happy. As soon as he caught sight of Eric, his attention immediately focused on him. "You there!" shouted Sir Ivar, stopping his pacing and pointing directly at him. Eric swallowed nervously, looking over his shoulder to see if perhaps there was somebody more noteworthy standing behind him. "I'm talking to you, Rothmane," confirmed Ivar, beginning to stomp his way forward. Eric scratched his head and smiled meekly. What had he done to garner the ire of a knight? He hoped that William hadn't done anything stupid last night after he'd left. "I was told that there were natural hot springs here. I haven't bathed in 3 days," exclaimed Ivar, staring at Eric expectantly. Eric stared blankly back at him. "Nobody told you not to wash yourself," piped up Azalea from her stump. Sir Ivar swiped his hand in Azalea's direction to dispel her meddling. "Well," continued Ivar, raising his arms in the air. "Leave the poor boy alone," said Azalea. "No, don't. Keep going," added August, entertained. Eric glanced between them anxiously. "Well, Lacdorian does have a hot spring, but the fumes are deadly, sir," explained Eric with an apologetic shrug. unsure of who had fed the knight his bad information. As soon as he'd said this, Ivar began shining red. "This is an outrage!" he shouted angrily, as August erupted into haughty laughter in the background. "Did the mayor not provide you with an ewer?" asked Eric, shocked at his mayor's negligence. "Of course I have a bloody ewer, but I was promised a hot spring," he yelled. "The nearest safe hot spring is at the base of Mistfall Mountain, sir. It's a day's journey northwest from here," explained Eric. Ivar's eyes lit up. "A day's journey?" he asked, spinning around to look at his fellow knights. He scurried over and stood before them. "We must make the journey post-haste," he declared. Azalea and August exchanged an uneasy glance with one another. "We are here to accompany the cleric to his hometown," began August. Ivar continued to simply stare back at him expectantly. "Is this Mistfall Mountain his hometown?" asked August, raising his eyebrows to accentuate his point. Ivar let out a sigh. He looked over his shoulder to see who was listening in. Luckily for him, the majority of the villagers were too intimidated by the knights to make eye contact, let alone be close enough to eavesdrop. Eric began slowly making his exit from the awkward situation. "Hey, don't you go anywhere!" commanded Ivar, pointing a finger at Eric. He gave a timid nod and stopped where he was. "Listen," said Ivar to his knightly compatriots quietly. "Does he even know that he's in his hometown?" he asked. Azalea and August gave each other an uncomfortable glance. "Does it matter? Our job is to accompany him to Lacdorian," reaffirmed Azalea. "And we've done that!" exclaimed Ivar, raising his arms theatrically. "Look around," he said, stretching his arms out and gesturing at the general area. The three knights looked around at the hungover commoners lumbering about in the muddy camp area. Eric could see that the reality of how out of place the three of them were was beginning to dawn on them. "Listen, Ivar, do you really think I don't want to relax in a hot spring? The feeling of that hot, bubbly water relaxing my sore muscles," began August, his eyes starting to glass over as he thought about it. "The stress of this entire pointless journey, the anger at being appointed such a waste of time, washed away as a group of comely maidens scrub my back and massage me, the dirt and grime of travel disappearing and being replaced by a feeling of pure, unadulterated bliss." He trailed off for a moment before his idyllic vision was interrupted by a peasant vomiting loudly in the mud. "Comely maidens aside," began Azalea, raising an eyebrow. "We have a job to do. We're not here for leisure," she verified. The three knights shared a glum sigh. "Listen, what if we bring the cleric with us?" asked Ivar expectantly. "Wait, this whole time you were imagining a scenario where we leave him behind?" questioned Azalea, flabbergasted. Ivar cleared his throat nervously. "No, of course not," he lied. "What if we asked the cleric whether he wants to go there?" asked August, now seemingly on board with Ivar's plan. The three of them shared a moment of silent accord. "I mean, if he wanted to go there, who are we to stop him?" asked Azalea, now also seemingly on board with the plan. The two of them looked up at Ivar expectantly. He seemed confused about why until it dawned on him. "No," he defended categorically. "Look, Ivar, it's your idea. If you want to go there, you're going to have to ask him yourself," said August seriously. But, Ivar looked between the two of them before seeming to have an idea. He slowly turned around to face Eric. "Absolutely not!" yelled Azalea, as if reading his mind. Ivar drooped his shoulders in disappointment. "Fine," he said. "I'll do it," he continued, taking a step towards the caravan before standing perfectly still. "Well?" asked August after a few moments. "Shut up. I'm thinking," said Ivar. "Oh, he's scared," giggled Azalea. "I am not," exclaimed Ivar, still not moving. "If you're so brave, why don't you do it then?" asked Ivar, raising an eyebrow at Azalea. She raised her hands defensively. Eric was surprised to see that even these 3 brave knights were just as uncomfortable around Father Marcus as the rest of their village was. This was a grim reality that hadn't dawned on him until now. He'd held knights in such high esteem that in his mind they were somehow immune to the fear that had crept into the rest of their hearts upon facing the man. "Okay, fine, here I go," said Ivar, courageously entering the caravan. Eric stared blankly at Azalea and August, unsure of whether he was allowed to move yet. The 2 of them stared back at him, amused. Both were clearly aware of his current predicament, but neither wanted to help him out of it. Said Eric nervously. "So can I go?" he continued, pointing towards the village. August raised his eyebrow. Well, Ivar did tell him not to go anywhere, did he not?" asked August to Azalea. Eric let out a sigh. Both knights chuckled. Before they could elaborate on their ruse, however, they were interrupted by the squire that had accompanied their group into Lacdorian. He came hurrying back into the encampment from town, huffing and puffing from running. The mayor says that the hot spring is unsafe," cried the squire, still gasping for breath. "Oh yeah, the kid told us already," said August, pointing his spoonful of porridge at Eric. The squire turned his head and looked at Eric dejectedly. "Oh," he said simply, before sitting down on the empty stump to catch his breath. At this moment, Ivar came back out of the caravan looking unsettled. "Well?" asked August hopefully. Well, yes," said Ivar, shooing the squire off his stump before taking a seat. The squire let out a disappointed sigh as he found a patch of dry dirt to sit down on. "I don't really know," explained Ivar honestly. "Well, what did he say?" asked Azalea, confused. "I asked him if he'd like to go to the Mistfall Mountain hot springs, and he said, 'Take me away, please,'" explained Ivar. "Well, that's great. Let's go," said August enthusiastically. "But," started up Ivar again. Then he started saying, "No, wife," finished Ivar. There was a silence over the group. "And that was it? You just left?" asked Azalea incredulously. "Well, he just started mumbling to himself again, and he wouldn't respond to me anymore," said Ivar. "So, does he want to go or not?" asked August. Ivar stared back at him vacantly and shrugged. Maybe at first he wanted to go, but then remembered that he proposed to that Lacdorian girl, so he wants to stay now? Guessed Azalea, looking around at her compatriots. August and Ivar's shoulders slumped as they considered this possibility. Perhaps he was saying, "Yes, I want to go to the hot springs, but not with my wife. No wife." "You know how women can be," theorized Ivar. Azalea rolled her eyes. "No, I don't know how women can be. Plus, they aren't even married yet," she replied flatly, scowling at him. Ivar shrugged in reluctant agreement. "But what if—" August's face suddenly lit up. "Hold on, what if he is saying, 'Yes, take me away to the hot springs. I want to spend time with my new wife there,'" he theorized excitedly. Ivar raised his eyebrows, as though considering this a very valid option. "That's a bit of a stretch, no?" asked Azalea. "I mean, what if we just bring her with us? Where's the harm in that?" asked Ivar excitedly. "No!" exclaimed Eric suddenly. He immediately regretted it when all attention was suddenly turned on him. "I mean, oh, no, I've got to get to the privy," stammered Eric awkwardly, beginning to make his escape. He needed to find William and discuss this new development. "Rotmine!" he heard Ivar calling after him. He stopped in his tracks. He couldn't just turn his back on a knight when they'd called his name. He took a breath and turned back around. "Yes, sir?" he asked politely. "You'll be our guide to these hot springs, yes?" proposed Ivar. Panic shot through Eric's body. This was an absurdly fortuitous opportunity for him. Being offered to do a job for a group of knights and a cleric of Bethmail was a rare prospect which was unheard of for a random farm boy from the Mistfall moors. He looked over at the cart with his father sleeping in it. What would his father say if he shot down doing a job for a group of knights? Even though he felt like in a way he was betraying William if he accepted, at least this way he could keep an eye on Anne-Marie. I mean, yes. Yes, of course I will, my lords, answered Eric firmly with a bow. Excellent, exclaimed Ivar, clapping his hands together excitedly. It's settled then. We'll bring the girl and head out to these Mistfall Mountain hot springs immediately. Squire, fetch the girl, commanded Ivar enthusiastically, pointing a finger in the air commandingly as he began to pack up some of his belongings. The squire let out an exasperated sigh before getting back up onto his feet. Eric gave one last polite nod before turning tail and breaking into a sprint. He had to get to William and tell him what was happening. They needed to come up with a plan, and fast. Chapter 6. Father Knows Best. When William had lazily wandered into the stables after his sleep-in, he'd immediately been riddled with guilt for being late. It appeared 3 of their horses were already rented out, with the one remaining in the process of being rented out to a festival-goer. Once the deal had been made and he was out of sight, William's father let out a sigh. "Looks to have been a big morning, Pa," said William, hoping to gauge his father's mood based on his response. "Aye," he responded distractedly. His father seemed a little despondent, and Will couldn't help but feel like perhaps it was due to his own absence from being in the stables at the crack of dawn this morning. He guiltily got to work, beginning his usual morning routine. "You'll need to be doing a full muck-out today," said his father, sitting down and writing down some notes pertaining to the deals which had been made this morning. William stopped what he was doing and wiped his brow. "Aye, father," he responded obediently. The truth was that he was a little thankful for the distraction that work would give him. "Pa?" began William, continuing his shoveling. His father didn't respond. "Did you know Father Marcus when you were young?" asked William. Although he didn't respond, he'd clearly caught his father's attention as he dropped what he was doing and looked up at Will. Before he could respond, however, suddenly Eric came bursting around the door of the stables. "William!" yelled Eric, completely breathless from running. As soon as he noticed William's father sitting in the corner, he adorned an expression of recognition. "My apologies, sir," said Eric, bowing politely to his father before grabbing a hold of a stable post and doubling over to catch his breath. William's father simply gave a nod of greeting. "Are you okay, Eric?" asked William, concerned about what could have spurred such a big lad to run so hard. Eric tried to respond but couldn't, due to his exhaustion. He held up his hand and continued to catch his breath for a moment. William's father let out a chuckle. "How's old Barty holding up today?" he asked. Upon being addressed by William's father, Eric decided to respond to him first. "He's doing well, sir. Still recovering from last night," responded Eric between huffed breaths. William's father gave a wry smile before returning to his paperwork. "William, we need to talk," said Eric, turning to William but glancing nervously at his father out of the corner of his eye. "Aye, what is it?" asked William. Eric signalled to William that he couldn't talk about it in front of his father by nodding in his direction. William thought about it for a moment before letting out a sigh. He needed to work. It wasn't fair on his father if he stopped and ran off to have a secret talk with his friend. "What is it?" asked William again, continuing to shovel while he talked. Eric looked at him exasperatedly before accepting the situation. "Look, there's not much time. The squire will be here any minute to pick up Anne-Marie. They're taking her to Mistfall," explained Eric hurriedly. "What?" exclaimed William. "Why in the world would they be going to Mistfall?" he asked. Eric blushed as he remembered that it was he who had told them about the hot springs there. "They're going to the hot springs, but it don't matter, Will. All that matters is that they're taking Anne-Marie with them," said Eric speedily. "What are you talking about?" piped up William's father suddenly. The two boys looked at each other in a panic. "Why would they be taking the neighbor girl with them?" he asked, confused about the entire situation. Well, you see, last night Father Marcus, he... William couldn't get the words out of his mouth. Even now there was a part of him which refused to accept what had happened. "Father Marcus proposed to Anne-Marie last night," explained Eric flatly. William's father looked surprised before confusion set in on his face. "Well, what's that got to do with you two?" he asked suspiciously. The two boys looked guiltily between each other. Realization suddenly dawned on his father's face as he looked at William. "William, this is absolutely none of your business," he decreed categorically. "But father, she don't want it," implored William desperately. There was no time for him to explain the whole situation to his father. "I don't care," he exclaimed, standing from his chair as the severity of the situation was suddenly dawning on him. "Do you two boys have any idea what kind of powers you're playing with here?" he asked, concern and anger plastering his face. William averted his gaze nervously. There was no way his father would ever understand what he was going through. "Aye, we do, sir, but, if I may," began Eric, testing the waters. William pleaded with his eyes for Eric to shut up, but Eric raised his hand to subdue William's silent protest. Panic began to set in as William realized that Eric didn't understand how scary of a man his father could be. "Sir, you must have seen him. You must have felt it. Surely you understand that we can't just let him take our friend away," reasoned Eric. Surprisingly, William's father's rage seemed to subside slightly. He took a deep breath before responding. "Aye, I felt it. But let me tell you, boys, you don't know the first thing about that man. Not the first thing," he said assuredly, looking between the two of them sternly. "William," he began, turning to address William directly, "I forbid you from involving yourself in his affairs. Do you understand me?" asked his father sternly. "But," began Will. "I'll not hear it," yelled his father, taking a few threatening steps towards William. He pointed his finger directly in William's face. "You'll stay out of that man's affairs. Now I want to hear 'yes, sir,'" demanded his father, looming over him threateningly. William quelled the tears of frustration and desperation which he could feel brimming. His respect for his father was far too great to go against his will. "Yes, sir," replied William, looking down at the floor. His father suddenly turned to Eric. "Eric," he began. Eric straightened up, preparing for what was to come. "I'm glad to see that you're looking well," said his father unexpectedly. Eric was taken aback by the sudden compliment. "Aye, thank you, sir," responded Eric politely. "I've always liked you," he continued. Eric nodded his head nervously. "You've always been a good friend for William," he added, closing his eyes and nodding. William anxiously watched on, hoping that his father was going easy on his oldest friend. "But I must say, I'm very disappointed that you'd entertain this stupidity," said his father, his eye twitching slightly. "Him?" he said, pointing at William without looking. "He's not bright enough to understand but you," he said, moving his arm around to point at Eric. "You should know better, and you know it too," he finished coldly. William was taken aback by how heartfelt his father was being. Eric looked at the ground despondently. He seemed to be considering William's father's words deeply. "Aye," he replied simply, surprising Will. "I just—" he started, looking up at Will. "I didn't want my friend to get hurt," finished Eric sincerely. William felt his fists clench. Did Eric not want to save Anne-Marie? Did he not care about her at all? Was he really doing this just because he felt pity for William? Did William really seem that weak and pathetic to him? If you really didn't want him to get hurt, you'd have told him how stupid it was to get involved in this in the first place," said William's father, walking back over to the workbench and sitting back down. "William," his father suddenly said. "Aye, father?" he asked, seething with a confusing cocktail of emotions, but remaining obedient. "Finish your work later. Go and talk with Eric," said his father, returning to his paperwork. "No, I think I'm good," said William coldly, staring at Eric as he returned to his work. "Hey!" shouted his father, banging his fist on the bench. William snapped his head around in surprise. "Don't make me tell you again, boy," he yelled furiously. William nodded his head obediently and put his pitchfork down before reluctantly leaving the stables with Eric. The two boys walked in silence back towards Eric's wagon. There was awkwardness in the air, but mostly hopelessness. It was like a dark cloud had been cast over them. "William," began Eric. "Just tell me this," interrupted William. "Did you ever really want to help Anne-Marie?" he asked seriously. "Of course I did," defended Eric, clearly annoyed at the implication that he didn't. Will let out a sigh. Even if he had said no, he's not the one in love with her. He was just trying to be a good friend. William's resentment was ill-placed, and he knew it, but he still didn't quite understand things from Eric's perspective. "Did you ever think we'd actually be able to stop it?" asked William, looking at Eric searchingly. Eric slowly shook his head. "Your father was right. It wasn't just you that I was being dishonest with Will. I wasn't being honest with myself. It's time that I started facing reality. Against a cleric of Bethmael, what are we to do?" asked Eric. Will shook his head in dismay. Before he could respond, he suddenly caught eye of the squire who had finally made his way into town. He was muttering to himself angrily as he walked. When he saw Eric, he scowled at him. "If you were in town anyway, don't you think you could have gotten the girl?" asked the squire angrily as he passed them by. Will looked between the two in confusion. Eric decided to keep his mouth shut and just keep walking. "Hey, I'm talking to you! You can't ignore me, you know. I'm practically a knight," shouted the squire. Eric and William raised their eyebrows and looked at one another. The squire couldn't have been more than a year or two older than them. "My apologies, sir," said Eric politely, bowing his head slightly. The squire looked a little uncomfortable at being addressed in this formal manner, but nodded and kept walking. "Good, good," he said as he kept walking. Although he had initially appeared satisfied, he suddenly stopped just after he'd passed the boys. He turned back around to face them. "Hey, look, don't tell Sir August that I said that I was practically a knight," pleaded the squire abashedly. Will and Eric smirked at each other, amused by the squire's antics. "Aye," said Eric with a nod before they continued in their opposite directions. There was a moment of silence between the boys as they kept walking. "What did he mean? Why would you have gone to get Anne-Marie?" asked Will, feeling oddly suspicious of his old friend. "The truth is, Will, they offered me a job. I'm to guide them to Mistfall," admitted Eric ashamedly. "What?" exclaimed William, stopping suddenly. Eric rubbed the back of his head anxiously. "Aye," he said. William stared at him for a moment. "Eric, that's amazing," said William happily. Eric looked back at him in confusion. "It is?" he asked, perplexed. "Aye, that means you can keep an eye on Anne-Marie," said William. "Well, yeah, it does. That was one of the reasons I accepted the job," replied Eric honestly. "Oh, so the glory and coin of working for knights had nothing to do with it, eh?" asked William coaxingly. Eric laughed. "Aye, I suppose that had something to do with it too," he replied with a smile. As the two boys neared the campgrounds, they slowed their pace until they stopped and turned to face one another. "Eric, please try to keep her safe," said Will seriously, holding out his hand expectantly. Eric nodded sincerely, before grabbing Will's hand and reciprocating their signature handshake. "I don't know how long the job is going to last, but I probably won't see you again for a while," said Eric. "Aye, it's been good seeing you, brother." "Thanks for putting up with all my shite," said William earnestly. Eric laughed heartily, patting Will on the back. He began to walk away before suddenly turning back to face Will. "Hey, once this is all blown over, are you going to marry her?" he asked. William smiled happily as he envisioned his future with Anne-Marie. "Aye," he replied with a nod. Eric smiled approvingly before turning around and continuing his way towards the campground. "Eric!" shouted Will suddenly, remembering one last thing. Eric turned around curiously. "Congratulations on the job," said Will, only now registering what it meant for a country boy like him to work directly for a band of knights. His drama with Anne-Marie had almost made him forget to commend his friend. "Thanks, Will," replied Eric earnestly before continuing on his journey. After watching him leave, William turned around and began his short walk back home. It didn't take long before he saw Anne-Marie and her parents walking in his direction, accompanied by the squire. He held his breath anxiously as he passed, trying to stop his nervous breathing from showing. When he made eye contact with Anne-Marie as they drew closer, she looked surprised to see him, before averting her eyes abashedly. William understood the situation better than she knew, but in this fleeting moment there was nothing he could say to her. He wanted to say goodbye, or to tell her that he understood, but as he walked past, all he could do was watch on silently as the love of his life was being led away from him and into the arms of that terrifying man. He felt useless. Was there really nothing that he could do to help her? As he walked home, the dark cloud which lingered over him intensified with every step he took away from her. When he reached home, William wished that he could just bury himself in his work and forget about everything, but no matter how hard he worked, he wouldn't be able to get the image of Anne-Marie walking away with the squire out of his mind. He began his full muck out of the stables, cleaning out all the wood shavings and replacing them with a fresh layer. He felt sick to his stomach the whole time as he pondered how to help Anne-Marie. The work didn't help to distract him in the slightest. After finishing the job, he let out a frustrated groan and threw his pitchfork down. "I don't understand it, Father. Why do people be treating them so fancy-like?" he asked, kicking a clump of the freshly strewn wood shavings against the wall in frustration. His father was hammering in a board on their stable wall, which had become loose. Will's whining was the last thing from his mind as he focused on the task at hand. He uttered a gruff, neutral grunt in response and continued on with his work. "Why do they even be calling him father? He ain't anyone's pa. What even is a cleric, anyway?" asked Will as he slumped over one of the stable windows. He looked down the road searchingly as though he'd be able to see the back of Anne-Marie and the squire, who were by now long gone. His anxiety began to build up in his stomach until it formed a knot of rage. Watching Anne-Marie's parents leading her down the road towards that dark cleric filled William with anger. How could they do that to their own daughter? Why do they be going along with it like it's nothing? They know bloody well what he's going to do to her. I wonder how much that foul bastard offered her family, grumbled Will as he sank deeper into his slumped posture over the window ledge. Upon hearing the sound of his father's hammer falling to the floor, Will knew that something was wrong. He quickly turned around, but before he had a chance to react, his father's hand was already in full swing towards his face. With no time to defend himself, he took the slap across his right cheek, causing him to lose his footing and fall down into the wood shavings which lined the stable floor. He subdued a yelp of surprise as he was struck down. Now on the floor, he shakily placed his palm over his cheek and feebly tried to stop tears from welling in his eyes in front of his father. He looked up in fear, confused as to how he had spurred such an attack. "That man is a cleric, if Bethmael. How dare you disrespect him like that? You'll never be half the man he is, and nor will I. He needn't offer gold. It's an honour for her family that he'd consider her at all. If your sister was of age, I'd ask that he take her instead," spat his father furiously. William knew that his antics had frustrated his father, but he had no idea how he'd somehow made the man quite this angry. "Father, I—" stammered Will, not sure how to atone for what he'd said. His father shook his head and took a deep breath. "Look, William, just drop it, okay? Forget about her, forget about Marcus, and just do your bloody job," groaned his father. William simply stared up at him and nodded obediently. Disappointment flashed over his father's face for a moment as he stared down over Will, sitting pathetically on the stable floor nursing his cheek. After a moment it was replaced by what seemed like remorse. He let out a sigh. He seemed like he was about to say something, but caught himself and left the stables in silence. William felt utterly miserable. He had never made his father this upset, and he still didn't even quite understand what he'd done wrong. He hugged his knees on the stable floor, fighting his urge to cry with every inch of his being. He'd disappointed his father enough for one day. Crying pathetically in a pile of wood shavings would be the final nail in the coffin. William's mother suddenly appeared at the stable door, investigating what the commotion had been about. "Willie!" she exclaimed, hurrying over to him and squatting down beside him. She put a concerned hand on his back. "Are you okay?" she asked. William nodded silently and got to his feet, still massaging his red cheek. "Where has father gone?" he asked, the knot of guilt in his stomach tightening by the second. "I just saw him take Bonnie out," said his mother, still looking over Will with concern. Bonnie was his father's personal horse, which he kept tied up out the back most days. "Are you sure you're okay, sweetie? Tell me what's wrong. What happened?" she asked. William started blushing as he realized how badly he needed somebody to comfort him. "I upset Pa," said William, still barely managing to hold back his tears. His mother looked surprised. "Why, what'd you do?" she asked, looking around the stables for some obvious sign of error. William let out a sigh. He didn't want to have to explain the whole situation to his mother. "I spoke badly of Father Marcus," said William quietly. Realization flashed across his mother's face. "Oh," she said, her eyes glazing over as she seemed to be thinking deeply. "Come with me, Willie," she said, walking towards the stable door and beckoning to him. He followed after her, fascinated by her unusually sombre tone. She led him around the back of the house, past the privy and down the hill a short way. She took him towards a bush, which she parted, revealing a wooden crate. William had no idea what was happening. He inhaled nervously as he anticipated what could possibly be inside. His mother opened up the lid of the crate, revealing its contents. Inside sat the fancy bridle and saddle which his father had made for Father Marcus. William stared speechlessly at it for a moment. He had absolutely no idea what this signified. He looked searchingly at his mother. "Why is that here?" asked William, looking at the wilderness around them as though it might shed some clues on the situation. "I saw it still on the gift table this morning," said his mother solemnly. "What? Father Marcus didn't care for it?" asked William in shock. Any Lacdorian should be ecstatic to be gifted something with so much of their village's spirit etched into every inch of it. "There's something wrong with him," said his mother darkly. "That's not the Marcus I remember," she continued, her eyes glazing over again as she seemed to be remembering something. "I suppose you fancied him like everybody else," blurted out William, immediately realizing that he only knew about Anne-Marie's mother's story because he had eavesdropped. William's mother looked at him in surprise. I did. But how did you know about that?" she asked in shock. "Did your father say something?" she asked, beginning to shine bright red. William let out a sigh. "No, Ma, I've just heard some stories about him is all," he said. His mother nodded understandingly. "I see. Well, yes, Willie, I'd be lying if I didn't say he was rather charming, but there's something you should know. It's about your father and him," she began. "Your father, he used to bully him horribly when we were kids," finished his mother, looking guilty for mentioning this. William was dumbstruck by this information. His quiet and reserved father, a bully. It seemed so unlikely that he could barely fathom it. "What?" he asked in shock. "Aye, your father, he matured faster than the other boys. He didn't grow that big overnight, you know," explained his mother. William wasn't sure why his mother was opening up to him about all of this. Marcus was very popular with the girls because he was quite feminine. We felt like he understood us better than the other boys did, but of course he was unpopular with many of the other village boys for the same reason, she explained. William listened on quietly, starting to realize how much of her story was corroborated by Anne-Marie's mother. "If father was a bully, then why did you marry him?" asked William. Would it be the same answer as always? Arranged marriage? "Oh, he grew out of all that. Plus, I weren't that spotless myself back then, you know," admitted his mother, realizing that she hadn't explained herself properly. "No. By the time we were of marrying age, your father had become the sweet man that he is today," explained his mother, shaking her head. William was shocked to hear that neither of his parents had always been as virtuous as they seemed to be today. "You know, Willie, he feels such guilt over the way he treated Marcus, especially since he left the village and became a cleric of Bethmail. Your father never had a chance to apologize for the way he treated him. That's why he made this, you see," explained his mother, gesturing to the saddle and bridle. William stared at it, perplexed. "So, why is it here?" he asked again. His mother let out a sigh. "I wanted your father to think that it had been accepted," she said, again drifting off deep into thought. "Father Marcus is too sick to receive gifts properly," thought William aloud as he comprehended the situation. "Aye. And on top of that, the meaning of this bridle is lost on those nights. They're not Lacdorian, they couldn't understand," said his mother, shaking her head. "William, I just thought you ought to know, it's not your fault that you've upset your pa. He's got his own hang-ups concerning Marcus, and hearing you disrespect the man probably brought some of that back up for him," she explained. William suddenly realized how unfair it was for his father to have struck him, but immediately let go of his resentment. The situation was complicated. There was a moment of silence as the two pondered the situation. "He's marrying Anne-Marie," said William quietly, fighting back tears which welled in his eyes as he uttered those cursed words. His mother looked shocked at first, before realization dawned on her face. "Oh, sweetheart, come here," she said, hugging him tightly. "No wonder you're so upset," she continued. "What can I do about it?" asked William, desperate for somebody to give him an answer. His mother seemed to think about his question deeply. William was touched that she was giving him this much respect, considering that she could easily disregard this whole drama as teenage nonsense. "William, I think you should wait it out," she said seriously. William let out a sigh. "Because he's sick, right?" asked William, remembering this being the first solution which Eric had offered too. "Well, yes, there's something wrong with that man to be sure, but I think you should just wait. Wait and see what happens. These things have a way of working themselves out," said his mother, kissing him on the forehead. "Aye, thank you, Mother," said William, thanking her more for consoling him than for providing him with any realistic solution to the problem. As the two of them walked back towards their house together, with their shared secret of the hidden bridle bonding them closer, William finally accepted the only solution to the problem that he could. He'd wait it out. He didn't care how long he was going to have to wait. He'd wait for Anne-Marie. He'd wait until their time was right. The two of them were soulmates. He could feel it, and he knew that she could too. It was only a matter of time before the timing would be right and they could be together. But just how long was that going to take?